Good morning. Thank you to all of you who are here today with us and to our panel. Today we're here in an event organized by the Center for Economic and Policy Research to present a new and important study called Did NAFTA Help Mexico? An assessment after 20 years. We're very honored and privileged to have a knowledgeable panel of experts with us. We have here Mike Weisbrot, the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and co-author of the report, as well as Wallach of Public Citizen. And we're quite privileged to have with us Representative Rosa DeLauro, who's going to talk to us about her recent work on these issues and the importance that this issue has for U.S. constituents. My name is Carlsen. I'm the director of the Americas program of the Center for International Policy Research, based in Mexico City. And I've been in Mexico City for the past 25 years now, so I'm especially pleased to see this report. It comes at a very important time. As many of you know, this is the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So 2 decades is quite enough time to take a really good look at what's happened. We've seen studies about the impact on jobs in the United States, but we've really seen very little, except for the increase in trade, about what's happened in Mexico. Yet from where we are, we've seen an enormous impact of NAFTA within Mexico. And we can say at this point that much of that has in fact been negative. So as we take a look at 20 years of NAFTA in Mexico in particular, it's especially important too because that NAFTA model, despite much of the negative impacts, has been continued over the years. And in fact, the United States government is now poised to extend the NAFTA model in a much broader version and deeper version called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In Mexico, just to give an idea, as well as the very important data that's in this report, when we look back on the past 2 decades, what we've seen is essentially flatline growth. We've also seen an increase in the absolute number of men, women, and children living in poverty over the NAFTA period. Now, this is obviously contrary to many of the promises of NAFTA at the time it was signed and went into force. And it means that the daily lives of millions and millions of Mexicans have gotten worse as a result of the trade policy. It's always tricky to talk about what's directly NAFTA related and what has to do with other policies. But when we look back at that negotiating period, and I remember it as being an observer and a policy analyst at that time, what we see is that NAFTA was to bring Mexico into the first world. It was billed as the way that Mexicans would become a more middle-income country, and that there would be an overall increase in the standard of living. And as we look at the social indices now, what we see is that that has not happened. We're also seeing an increase in poverty in general and in food poverty, which is kind of a fancy way of saying hunger. And this, ironically, is happening in the countryside. In the countryside, as a direct result of imports, agricultural imports under NAFTA, we've seen the displacement of some 2 million small and medium-sized farmers, mostly campesinos, peasant farmers, as well as indigenous farmers. This has led to a situation of increased poverty in the rural sectors, and again, a concentration of hunger precisely where food is grown, as much of that food has been transferred to food for export, leaving subsistence farmers and small farmers without land and without the ability to grow food for their families and for the nation as a whole. We've also seen that this flatline growth has led to a lack of sufficient job creation, another reason that NAFTA was supposed to help Mexico. The job creation, as we'll see in the report, that has happened has been well below the approximately 1 million jobs a year that Mexico needs because of its demographics to provide employment for people entering the workforce. And also, there's been a change in the way those jobs have been created, what kind of jobs are being created, primarily because where there has been an increase in employment has been in the informal sector. The informal sector, as many of you know who've been to Mexico, are the self-employed that have the stalls in the streets, are vendors in the streets, and a wide variety of activities because it's all that they can do. This is especially a sector where women are employed, and it's where people do not have benefits, they don't have job security, and they most often do not have enough income to feed their families as a result. It's a sector where underemployment is rampant. The displacement of the small farmers has also led to another phenomenon that wasn't supposed to happen under NAFTA, and that's the huge increase in migration to the United States. Now, this correlation between NAFTA and the surge in migration of mostly undocumented workers to the United States is so obvious in terms of time and looking at the statistics, and also because of the dynamics of the displacement, that there's no longer any real debate about whether or not it was directly caused by NAFTA. The competition between small-scale farmers working on less than 2 acres in Mexico with subsidized and large-scale agricultural products from the United States was basically impossible from the beginning. And instead of being able to leave the land and find jobs in the industrial sector, many of them were not able to find jobs and ended up being forced into migration to the United States, causing a source of friction between the United States and Mexico, as well as migration being changed into this kind of security framework where not only were they expelled from their land, but that they were then criminalized for seeking a livelihood within the United States. This is a case where we see that NAFTA and other types of policies within the United States were working at cross purposes. And yet we've rarely had a moment to step back and reflect on that and say what's gone wrong here and what needs to be fixed before we move forward with these trade and investment policies that have had negative effects, not just in the United States, but in particularly on developing countries like Mexico. So for these reasons, and because much of this information that's coming out in these facts-based analysis of the impacts of free trade agreements is not available to people in the press, and what we usually see are the increases in trade figures, the great success in increasing exports and imports between our countries, rather than looking at human rights and the quality of life for citizens. Because there's a big gap there, we're especially pleased to be able to present this report today that goes behind the trade figures and looks directly at the impact on people's lives. To begin, I'm pleased to present Mark Weisbrot. He is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, and he's written numerous research papers on economic policy, especially on Latin America and international economic policy. He is also co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crisis, and he writes a weekly column for The Guardian Unlimited and a regular column on economic and policy issues distributed to over 550 newspapers by McClatchy Tribune Information Services. His opinion pieces have come out in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and all major U.S. newspapers across the country, as well as Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo. He appears on national and local television and radio programs. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, I need this mic. Probably don't. Can everybody hear? So it's great to have this panel, and I'm glad to have people who have done such great work on these issues. And I noticed that it's the first time that I can remember that I've been the only male on a panel in Washington, D.C. It's a rare event. And so, I remember when this was being debated 20 years ago, and it was a pretty one-sided debate, and it was I think it's actually a lot better now. After 20 years of public education, and we can thank people like Lori and the Public Citizen for that, you see more of a debate. But back then, it was pretty one-sided. And I remember in Washington, there was an outbreak of cryptosporidium in the water here, and everybody had to boil their water. And the joke around town was that, you see what happens, NAFTA goes into effect and you can't drink the water here. And everybody thought that NAFTA would have a bad impact on the U.S. And we've done research here, and if people have questions about the effect on the U.S. Economy, I can talk to that too. But everyone, the consensus was that NAFTA was going to gain from it. NAFTA was going to be that Mexico was going to be the big winner. And so here I have, if you everybody here should have a copy of the low-tech PowerPoint. And if you go clockwise, you can see the first thing is just to compare NAFTA with the rest of the region. And NAFTA comes in 18th out of 20 Latin American countries. Mexico. And it comes in 18th out of 20 countries in terms of its growth in income per person. Now, this is the most basic measure that GDP per person, or real GDP adjusted for inflation, or income, is the most basic measure that economists have of what happens to living standards in the last 20 years. So there's Mexico, 18th out of 20. And you can also compare it to the past of Mexico. From 1960 to 1980, the economy practically doubled, the Mexican economy, in per person terms. Again, that's what matters. And so it grew by over 98%. Income per person. And then in the past 20 years, it's grown by just 18.6%. Okay, if you turn to the next page, we just have a graph of what happened in the region. And Mexico, again, is another way of looking at the big slowdown that happened. You had real growth in Latin America and in Mexico during the 60s and 70s, and then you have a crash. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But again, Mexico's growth is about half of what the rest of, or Latin America, I should say, the whole region as a whole did in the last 20 years. And so it is possible, of course, you don't have the counterfactual, it is possible that Mexico could have done even worse without NAFTA, but it's really hard to see how that could have happened. Now, what does this mean in the long term? Well, if NAFTA had really just restored the normal growth that Mexico had in the 1960 to 80 period, when they were doing everything that Washington didn't really want them to do, they would be a relatively high income country today. They would have an income significantly higher than Portugal or Greece, for example, and you wouldn't have really much discussion about immigration in the United States because very few people would be wanting to come over the border here, and certainly not illegally, to find a job or to get higher pay. And here's a graph that if you can see this figure on the next page, of Mexico versus South Korea. This is something that most people don't know here, that and it's a story of Latin America too, that you had growth prior to 1980. You had growth in Mexico that was comparable. It was about the same, actually, as South Korea. South Korea started out a lot poorer. And then all of a sudden you can see on this graph that Mexico's growth collapses and it never recovers. And this graph just shows you what happened if Mexico had just grown at its prior rate from 1980. And it would be like the Netherlands today, okay, with a per capita income of $41,000. Now, there's nothing impossible about this. This is what South Korea actually did, and they ended up, a high-income country today, somewhere between France and Spain in terms of their income per person. So something terrible happened. A whole set of policies. It wasn't just a debt crisis. There was a whole set of policies that were adopted, and NAFTA was really part of that. In fact, if you look at the history of it, any economist will tell you, or any historian, that NAFTA was designed to lock in and expand the policies that were already in place put in place beginning in the 1980s, and that's what it did. And again, it was supposed to lead to growth and development, and it didn't. The next graph you can look at is just the poverty level based on a national statistic. And here you can see from 1994 to 2012, which is the latest data, no change in the poverty rate. 52.4% in 94 and 52.3% in 2012. So that's, again, terrible. And again, we can compare it to the rest of the region. So I'll just skip to the bar graph where you can see on the next page what happened to poverty by the Economic Commission in Latin America statistics. Now, these statistics are computed a little differently, so you do see some decline in poverty in Mexico, but it was very small compared to the decline in the rest of the region. Okay, so you had an 8 percentage point decline over 20 years in Mexico, 20 percentage points in the rest of the region. Why? Because in spite of the terrible economic failure that went on for more than 20 years in Latin America, in the 2000s you had a rebound in the rest of the region. Okay, and in Mexico it didn't happen. So that's what happens when you don't have growth. It's very hard to do anything about poverty. The next graph is average wages, and you can see, and these are wages of Mexican workers that are in the formal sector, covered by the Social Security system, and you have almost no wage growth at all. In fact, you have barely any growth all the way over 1980. There's only 2.3% growth over the past 32 years. And again, it goes to 2012. So this is something, again, showing how badly people fared. Unemployment, 5% today versus 2.2% in 1994. Now, these are really exaggerated lowest levels. Of course, it's much higher than this, but because of the way unemployment is measured there, you have to not have worked even 1 hour in a week, and so basically there's almost no social safety net. So everybody's trying to do something. But what it does show you is the deterioration in the labor market. So in other words, if you look at underemployment, which is a broader measure, it's at 8.5%. Now, those statistics don't go all the way back to 94. They only go to 2005. But the point is, you have a serious deterioration in the labor market, which is what Laura mentioned at the beginning. And part of it, of course, you can see in the next table what happened in agriculture. These are Mexican census statistics from 1991 to 2007. And you can see that almost 5 million people in the family farm sector, as Laura mentioned, they couldn't compete with U.S. subsidized corn and other products, and corn was the biggest one. And so 4.9 million people were displaced from family farms. And of course, we knew this was going to happen, but they said, well, these people they'll get jobs producing fruits and vegetables for the export market. Well, some of them did, but not enough. About 3 million jobs there, so you have a net loss of 2 million. And the next table shows actually, the table is not labeled right, but the numbers are there. It's the immigration to the United States, immigration from Mexico to the United States, and you can see a big jump from 1994 from 430,000 a year to 470,000. To 770,000 from 1994 to 2000. That was the big jump after NAFTA. Now it's slowed down, of course, after 9/11 and the increased security at the border and more violence along the border discouraged immigration. immigration. So, but this was a big jump, and you can also see the Mexican-born population in the United States growing during this period from 4.5 million. It doubles by 2000 to 9.4 million, and more than doubles, and then it peaks at 12.6 million in 2009. Again, as I said before, if it wasn't for the terrible performance of the Mexican economy, I don't think you'd have a lot of people wanting to leave. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit in the remaining minute about the macroeconomic policy that was related to NAFTA that led to these failures. Because one thing that happened was NAFTA helped tie Mexico to the U.S. economy. And this was a very bad time for this because, first of all, we became dependent on bubble growth in the last 20 years. And when those bubbles break, they cause recessions, as we had in 2001, and of course the Great Recession from the real estate bubble bursting in 2008, 2009. And so these recessions, you can see in the graph, had a devastating effect on Mexico. Mexico lost more output than most countries in Latin America, 6.7% of GDP during the Great Recession, 9.5% of GDP during the peso crisis, which was also caused not by a recession that time in the U.S., but by the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. And then you see again in May of this year, Mexico getting hit by the Fed tapering. Again, because it's tied to the U.S., because it has this enormous market for foreign exchange, and it's traded 24 hours a day. And so investors around the world, when something bad happens and they want to reduce their exposure in emerging markets, Mexico is the first place they go. Now, that's not a situation you want to be in if you're a developing country. Again, a lot of the reforms that led to that, the ownership of the country banking system, 70% foreign-owned, this was a result of NAFTA and the desire to do what foreign investors wanted and write it into an international agreement. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. The next person on the panel who will speak is Lori Wallach. And Lori Wallach is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch and has been the director there since 1995. She's an expert on the operations and outcomes of trade policies such as NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, CAFTA, and others. She also is very knowledgeable about the domestic and international politics of current trade negotiations and disputes. Wallach works closely with Congress and civil society, scholars, and activists in the United States and developing countries to foster the growing debate about the implications of different models of globalization on jobs, offshoring, wages, the environment, public health and food safety, equality and social justice, and democratically accountable governance. Thanks, Lori. You have a mic on this?
So it's been a very powerful tour of the 20-year outcomes of NAFTA in Mexico. And as Mark said, Mexico was the country who ostensibly was projected to be a winner. But in the U.S., NAFTA was sold to a very skeptical Congress and public by also projecting major gains for the United States. Namely, the creation, according to President Clinton, then President Clinton, of 200,000 U.S. jobs per year in the first 4 years alone, per year, 1 million jobs, higher wages, and then we were warned about what would happen if there was no NAFTA, a foreign policy crisis. Migration from Mexico would explode. The country could devolve into a failed narco state on our own border. It's very funny. NAFTA passed. And actually, Mexico's having some of those very problems. And in fact, part of the cause is actually the agricultural provisions in NAFTA that destroyed licit livelihoods in the countryside throughout Mexico. We tomorrow are going to release a new study on the impacts of NAFTA that mainly focuses on the 20-year record for the U.S. Part of the data on Mexico is included, but nothing as comprehensive as Mark's excellent report. the data that we've looked at is the U.S. government data from all of the agencies, which we've crunched and cross-tabbed and inflation controlled to try and wring out the actual data that is underlying a clear political reality. And the political reality is that the 20-year legacy of NAFTA is now casting a long shadow on President Obama's attempt to obtain fast-track trade authority to be able to railroad through Congress a massive expansion of NAFTA through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. TPP is premised on the NAFTA model. It would extend those rules to additional countries and further deepen that model. So both the data on NAFTA's effect in the U.S., but probably more impactfully the lived experience of Americans for 20 years of NAFTA, is entirely coloring the debate now on TPP and fast track. And indeed, opposition to NAFTA, as polls as recent as being in the field 3 weeks ago show, is one of the only issues on which Democrats, Republicans, and independents all by majorities agree NAFTA was a bad thing for the country and for their families, the polling shows. And moreover, not only does that opinion engulf the partisan divides, it engulfs geographic divides and demographic divides, which is to say, it is not only, as was in the first 10 years of NAFTA, only people making $50,000 and less who are saying this. It goes all the way up through the fourth income quintile in the crosstabs in the most recent poll. So what is the data? Now, I will leave some of it, some of the new data, because, of course, only on Sunday did the Department of Commerce release the corrected end-of-year 2013 trade data. So only on Sunday could one start crunching the full 20 years of NAFTA data. But with leaving a little bit aside, some of the lowlights include, for the U.S., and again, why Fast Track and TPP are especially contentious, a very large new NAFTA trade deficit. And basically what we saw is what was a small surplus with Mexico turning into a deficit. We exported a lot of corn. We dumped a lot of subsidized corn in Mexico. It wiped out many of these campesino livelihoods. The Mexican government data looking at both the farmers and the people in rural economies who supported them has numbers over 3 million. However, short of that, our exports to Mexico, the growth of them, actually dropped. In goods, 62%. Our export, I just want to say it again, if you look at the data, U.S. export growth has dropped 62% in the goods, in the merchandise goods category, relative to pre-NAFTA. And here's the real shocker. The export growth in our services, where we have actually a surplus, dropped 49%, the growth rate, relative to pre-NAFTA. Now that is counterintuitive, right? Theoretically, you get rid of trade barriers, and then you have exports growing. That is just a hint of the enticing data that will be in tomorrow's report. There are other many counterintuitive and counterfactual findings that are highly factual and footnoted with 400 footnotes back to the original source. So in addition to that trade deficit, what is the effect then on the big issue? Jobs. We were promised 200 jobs per year. We found that there was no 200,000 net jobs in that trade balance to be created in any year of NAFTA, because in each year the deficit has gotten bigger and bigger. The exports that did expand were swamped by floods of imports. And in fact, just to put down the red herring of the week, the U.S. share, the share of oil that comprises the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and Canada has plummeted. It used to be almost 75%. It is about 40 now. So actually, if you take out oil, energy altogether, the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and Canada since NAFTA, just in merchandise goods, 13% larger. We had a small surplus with Mexico and a $20 billion $2 billion surplus with Mexico and a $20 billion deficit with Canada before NAFTA. This year's year-end is a $179 billion deficit. So if you plug those numbers into the U.S. government multiplier for what each $1 billion in trade represents with respect to U.S. jobs, and you do that over a period of time, as we saw in the series of studies done 10 years after NAFTA, already at NAFTA in 2004, using the government data, NAFTA would have cost 1 million net U.S. jobs based on the data of the trade flows using the government multiplier. What were those jobs? In our study, we unveil a newly, even more searchable version of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Database, which identifies, its Department of Labor, identifies by zip code, geo-mapped onto congressional districts, by category, by company name, by city name, by state name, by kinds of search now, 845,000 specific U.S. jobs certified as casualties of either job offshoring to Mexico and Canada under NAFTA or increased import competition under NAFTA. So with all of that as the background, it is an interesting moment for the president to be heading next week to a Three Amigos summit in Mexico. Now, obviously this was long planned, but certainly it cannot be helpful in the context of NAFTA casting a long shadow over the president's attempt to do a NAFTA expansion to the Pacific and get special authority from Congress to do so, to go to Mexico during the 20th anniversary year of NAFTA, to try very much never to say that word NAFTA while actually going to the country that we have the agreement called NAFTA with, while actually it being the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, which makes it really hard not to say the word NAFTA, which actually is like a cancer on the effect of having TPP, aka NAFTA on steroids. So with the president heading next week to the Three Amigos Summit, I will just basically conclude by saying that the public's attention will be more brought to the legacy of NAFTA, and that can only increase what, again, the polling shows is broad opposition to more of the NAFTA model. What was that NAFTA model? Totally different than previous trade agreements. It included investment rules that promoted offshoring. It did not discipline subsidies in agriculture, but required countries to move all food security rules, so all supply management, all price supports. It had patent extensions, new monopolies in a free trade agreement. It had financial deregulation. It basically was a delivery mechanism for one economic model. And now 20 years later, we've seen the results. And it's not surprising that there is broad opposition to deepening and expanding that model through the TPP.
Thanks. I mentioned before that we're honored to have with us today Representative Rosa DeLauro, and she is the U.S. representative for Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District, serving since 1991. Congresswoman DeLauro serves in the Democratic leadership as co-chair of the Steering and Policy Committee, ranking member on the Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee, where she oversees U.S. investment in education, health, and employment. The Congresswoman has been a champion for greater transparency around the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, negotiations, as well as deeper consultations of congressional committees whose jurisdiction is implicated by the TPP. In November of 2013, Congresswoman DeLauro and Representative George Miller co-authored a letter signed by more than 150 members of Congress opposing the fast track that Lori mentioned procedure for passage of future free trade agreements, or trade agreements. DeLauro is also deeply engaged in U.S. trade policy toward Latin America and is a member of the Congressional Monitoring Group on Labor Rights in Colombia.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I want to acknowledge, first of all, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a valuable contributor to our public debates, and thank you for organizing the briefing, and particularly for compiling this important paper, and which is one of the few to focus on the impact of NAFTA on Mexico's economy and society. And 20 years later, we need to assess, which is what's being done, this treaty in detail, from all perspectives, before we think of embarking on another one. I want to thank everyone else who's contributed today. Mark, thank you, and Lori, and Public Citizen, and you, Laura, for the really for the laying out of what has specifically happened in Mexico and to the rural countryside and communities in Mexico. Both the report and your commentary, that information isn't often transmitted to the United States and to my colleagues as well, to have a real understanding of what's happened in Mexico, as well as our focus is usually what's happened here, and we know those effects, but we haven't been really cognizant of all that happened there. So, as Lori pointed out, the President will travel to Mexico next week. He will meet with leaders of Canada and Mexico to talk about issues, economic competitiveness, entrepreneurship, trade, and investment. And it is on the heels of the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. And as Congress is being pushed by the administration to pass another massive trade agreement with 11 Pacific Rim nations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. We need to look carefully at the record before proceeding. And NAFTA's legacy has been very troubling for American workers, to say the least. Since joining NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, the good manufacturing jobs that help forge America's middle class have been offshored. The focus is always when the proponents, whether it was NAFTA or whether it is at TPP, is the increase in exports. There isn't any focus on the imports and what happens here in that regard. Millions of manufacturing jobs have disappeared and have been replaced by low-wage service sector work. And the jobs that have stayed have been transformed, quite frankly, for the worse. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2 out of every 3 displaced manufacturing workers rehired in 2012 experienced a wage cut, most of them more than 20%. Since NAFTA went into effect, real median wages have hardly increased at all. Meanwhile, the share of national income collected by the top 10% of Americans has risen by 24%, and the top 1% by 58%. My colleagues have presented the disastrous impact of NAFTA on Mexico and the United States. Let me briefly touch on what this legacy could mean for today's debates about fast track and the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. In his State of the Union and elsewhere, President Obama rightly called for policies to address stagnant wages and the lack of upward mobility that currently exists in the United States. This is not just an issue for the moment. This is a challenge that we face as a generation. And when you take a look at the policies that the President talked about to address this challenge, he talked about increasing the minimum wage, supporting job training, and ensuring equal pay for equal work. All of these I strongly support and am fighting for in the Congress. Yet, as our experience with NAFTA suggests, this push to fast-track the Trans-Pacific Partnership through Congress works at cross purposes with this goal. And if you mind, I would just like to quote maybe a colleague of many here, Harold Meyerson, who wrote in January, when the case for free trade is coupled with the case for raising U.S. workers' incomes, it enters a zone where real numbers and real Americans' lives matter. In that zone, the argument for the kind of free trade deal embodied by NAFTA, permanent normal trade relations with China and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, completely blows up. Such deals increase the incomes of Americans investing abroad, even as they diminish the incomes of Americans working at home. they worsen the very inequality against which the president rightly campaigns. The Peterson Institute supported NAFTA, but they noted in a recent report on the TPP that the benefits of the agreement are driven in part by export gains, mainly in advanced sectors like business and financial services, and in agriculture and food. They estimated that as much as 39% of the observed growth in U.S. wage inequality since NAFTA is attributable to trade trends. Overall, Peterson concedes that the United States would become more import-dependent in manufacturing. And that is because the TPP agreement includes similar incentives for companies that we saw in NAFTA. Incentives to outsource jobs and to leave American workers at the mercy of fiercer competition than ever. We know how this ends, with many more job losses and wages being further depressed. And we've heard that from our other speakers today. With NAFTA, the issue was Mexico's $10 a day wages. TPP includes Vietnam and its minimum wage of 28 cents per hour. And families will feel the brunt of this agreement elsewhere as well. The TPP touches on a wide range of issues, from the price of medicines to labor and environmental protections to the safety of the food we consume, that will all too likely negatively impact people here and around the world. You know, they say that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. We should take a lesson from NAFTA. Rather than pursuing trade deals that ship our jobs overseas, and I might add technology as well, we have quite frankly become a nation that doesn't build anything anymore. We just consume what comes from other countries. We should be pursuing policies that create good middle-class jobs, that enhance our manufacturing capability. We should incentivize manufacturing, rebuild our infrastructure, invest in education and training, restore the foundations of our long-term prosperity, and which makes us a nation that builds again. Rather than allowing trade to trump public health and environmental protections at home and abroad, we should be prioritizing consumer protections and working to ensure that the food in our refrigerators and that the food that's on our kitchen tables, wherever it comes from, is safe and it is not contaminated. Our experience with NAFTA is one reason why there is such a strong opposition to the TPP in both Congress and the public at large. According to a recent poll by Heart Research Association's 3 in 5 voters, 62%, feel this is a convincing argument against fast-track authority. They answer affirmatively to the statement on the TPP that, quote, "This is a NAFTA-style trade deal, and since NAFTA, the United States has run up an $8 trillion trade deficit, resulting in millions of lost manufacturing jobs." Roughly 3/4 of the House Democrats and dozens of Republicans also oppose granting fast track to the administration, because we should learn from our recent history. And we should think twice about signing on to free trade deals that threaten to destroy jobs, depress wages, and only further accelerate a race to the bottom. 20 years after NAFTA, we should learn from what happened and work harder to do right by the families that we represent in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on this panel, we have presented the report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the new one on the impact on Mexico, and mentioned several other reports and a whole slate of evidence that indicates the negative impact of NAFTA. And that it's almost difficult to believe, but as Lori mentioned, on February 19th, the 3 North American leaders will be gathering in Toluca in Mexico, and discussing the expansion of NAFTA into this Trans-Pacific Partnership. And at the same time, since NAFTA itself has become such a political liability in all three countries, it's very unlikely that it will be discussed directly. This is a play in semantics, and it will be the responsibility of the researchers, of the press, and of the populations in all three countries to keep these facts in the forefront of any discussion that tries to move a NAFTA model forward. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened up until now. I just want to mention one more thing before we go into the discussion and the question and answer period, and that is that while many of these facts, most of these facts are not in the news, especially in terms of what's happened in Mexico under NAFTA, sadly, Mexico is in the news, and what it's in the news for is the huge explosion of violence that we've seen lately. And there's really no question that that violence is closely related to what has happened to our communities under the free trade agreement. Just recently, the leader of the self-defense organizations in Michoacan, which is a very controversial phenomenon that we've seen just in this past year, in which communities that were not being protected from organized crime in their region to actually have taken up arms. And he described a scenario, he's a lemon grower, in which with the elimination of guaranteed prices and many of what are considered basic development tools for developing countries under a free trade agreement, they no longer have markets for their agricultural produce. Many of the government services, including storage and marketing programs that made it possible to be a small-scale farmer in the past, were eliminated under NAFTA and the neoliberal reforms that form kind of the NAFTA package. And as a result, in this vacuum, organized crime entered into the zones. The kind of things that they're asking, economic policies that have to be basic to any kind of a pacification strategy in Michoacan and other parts of Mexico that are seeing this terrible outburst of crime, are actually in many cases prohibited under this free market, free trade style agreement. We have to take this under consideration. We have to ask ourselves many of these questions before we go forward. How would a TPP affect jobs, not just in the United States, but in other countries? Could it trigger instability in developing countries, in our neighbors and our partners? Because that's in the end important for U.S. national security as well. What kind of an impact would it have on daily lives? In order to get this out, there has to be more transparency, as the Congresswoman mentioned, so that it becomes a subject of public debate. With that, we're happy to open up to questions from the audience. Thanks.
Hi, Will Malden, Wall Street Journal. Mark, we haven't mentioned our prosperous neighbor to the north, so I'm wondering if that means that we all think Ottawa did well from NAFTA. And also, putting a couple things together that I've read from your report, we talk about NAFTA leading to some migration outside of Mexico to the U.S. Recently, there's been talk about emerging middle class in Mexico and less migration to the U.S. Is putting those ideas together, does that mean NAFTA caused Mexicans to migrate from the U.S. to Mexico and then to come back to a life of middle class, or is that oversimplified or correct? Several themes.
Well, I mean, you don't see any evidence in the data of a growing middle class in Mexico. Your poverty is flat for 20 years. Your wages are flat. Unemployment is worse. So where does the middle class come from? Maybe they're thinking of Carlos Slim, who's accumulated over $66 billion in the past 20 years. You know, there's definitely some billionaires who've gotten enormous fortunes. But I don't see where you get the data that shows it. You know, I think what happens is people go to Mexico and they see wireless internet and cafes, and they see, there's probably more middle-class people than there were 20 years ago, which is probably true because the population grows, but there's also 14.3 million more people living below the poverty line, and they don't see them. So they don't hang out in the same places. And so I think that's where that comes from. Canada, I haven't looked at that recently, but, they were the first to lose from the U.S., from the agreement with the United States, because they had stronger organized labor and somewhat higher wages, and those got pushed down when they first signed the agreement with the United States. And I'm sure you have, Laura, you have more information on Canada. Go ahead. I'm sure they lost as well, and they also have the same problem of being increasingly tied to the U.S. economy at a time when, again, for 20 years, this economy has become dependent on bubble growth. And I want to say just one quick thing about that, because these issues are actually related. The reason that we have been dependent on bubble growth for 20 years is because we've had a chronic trade deficit, and that if that happens, it's definitional. You're either going to have some kind of bubble growth, or you're going to have a growing U.S. Trade deficit, or both. A growing U.S. federal budget deficit, or both. If you run a chronic trade deficit, you're either going to have. It's just a matter of national income accounting. You have to have something that, like in the housing bubble, where investment increases, much faster than savings, where savings rate went to zero, or you can have a growing federal U.S. budget deficit, or you can have both of those things. That's what has to balance the trade deficit. So these are related problems even for the United States.
I would just to add on the Canada front, well, first, just on the Mexico issue, there was a series of stories that ran in various publications and a big push by, I know which PR firm, to do the story of Mexico's more robust middle class. But the data, we also went through all that data, actually shows a slight increase in income inequality. Not slight, but small. It's not as big as the U.S. one in Mexico, which started out more unequal, but is yet more unequal in the 20 years of NAFTA if you actually look at the income distribution. So that the data just doesn't show that. I guess you can take a picture of people shopping at a Walmart and think of that as being more middle class, but there was, we looked at that data after those stories to see what was the real data, and it's not there. On Canada, in a way, Canada's biggest losses have been because of their higher standards. Not even so much in the offshoring, though there's been some of that, but specifically, they've been the biggest target of investor state cases under NAFTA as far as cash paid out. So, there have been $365 million paid out under NAFTA's first 20 years in investor state cases. And Canada has gotten clobbered repeatedly. I mean, some of them have been settlements. The Abitibi-Bowater case was about water rights, riparian rights, and water use issues. And that was, as I recall, $40 million as a settlement. There was $15 million paid out over Ethel Corporation's successful investor state attack on a ban on a toxic gasoline additive. Mexico's ban, actually under the Basel Convention, the Multilateral Environmental Treaty, on cross-border trade in toxic waste got nailed, and that was millions of dollars. And all of those payouts have also had a chilling effect. So the government, for instance, is having higher insurance costs because there's a proposal to do a no-fault insurance plan for certain areas. The government actually does a risk pool insurance in certain provinces. That was threatened with the NAFTA investor state case and chucked out. So the one of the real losses for Canada under NAFTA has been in all of these attacks on policies that would have made people's lives better and the government thought some of their costs lower. And now, if those cases weren't chilling enough, Eli Lilly is currently demanding just under $500 million in an investor state case attacking the revocation of 2 medicine patents and attacking Canada's entire patenting system. And there is a huge case, a claim on a ban for a province for fracking, for a moratorium on fracking. And ExxonMobil just won a case that has not gone to the damages phase, but people speculate the damages will be around $90 million for having a renewable energy contract fee for domestic and foreign companies doing offshore exploration. You get a license, you put into this fee for research about renewables. And ExxonMobil argued that having to pay, even though the domestic firms do, is a violation of their NAFTA investor rights. They have won in the merits, and they're about to get the cash payout amount very soon. So that's the Canada story.
Yes.
Hi, Howard LaFranchi with Christian Science Monitor. I had a question. I noticed that on the Latin American countries' average annual growth, top of the list are countries in the United States. I know they're not as long, but Chile, we've had a pretty long time, and then it goes down to Colombia, much higher than Mexico. So I'm wondering, is there something else? Is there something about Mexico other than the free trade agreement that explains why Mexico's growth is so low compared to other Latin American countries? And then secondly, the question about the point about all the campesinos, the farmers who left have had to leave farms that were smaller than 2 acres. And I'm just wondering, in those 2 decades also, if that's something that, would that have been viable? So were there other, other trends going on? I mean, I know about the dumping of corn, but I'm wondering if, is that, and maybe that question would be for Laura, I don't know, but if again, it's not just NAFTA, but something else that, that had people leaving, very small farms.
Yeah. On the question of other countries, how long has Peru had a the commercial agreement with the U.S.?
It went into effect in 2008.
Yeah, so this is really not that comparable. And Chile, Chile's most of their trade is not with the United States.
2003.
Also, Chile's growth, by the way, is a lot of it was driven by copper in the last decade or so. So there are different explanations for the growth in the different countries, but obviously Mexico did other things that there are other economic policy changes that really made Mexico the worst, and I didn't have time to cover them, but some of them are in the paper. If you target inflation, as they did, at 3%, which is kind of low for a developing country, and the central bank says this is what we're going to do and we don't care what happens to the exchange rate, you're going to have a problem because investors are not going to know what the exchange rate is going to be a year from now. So you can get an overvalued exchange rate. And they're competing with China in the U.S. market. China targets its exchange rate. It keeps it fixed to the U.S. dollar, or since 2005 to a basket of currencies. And so they're going to lose that battle, and they have. And of course, they're competing on wages with China in the U.S. market since 2001 especially. And their wages, Mexican wages in 2002 were like $5.30 something an hour, and China's were 63 cents. And now China's have gone up a lot, but there's still a huge gap, something like $6 in Mexico and $1.74 in China. And again, they have transportation advantage, and those wages aren't exactly comparable, but there's a huge gap. So they, what NAFTA did, as I tried to say this, it set up a whole model of development and macroeconomic policy that was really deadly. And so it is more than that. And, we don't have that much time, so I won't go into it for too much. But just to say, you did have this huge economic failure in all of Latin America from 1980 to 2000. The worst. It was one of the worst economic failures in the history of capitalism, really, in terms of growth of income per person. You can't find anything of that long of a period. It's very hard to find. You have to go back 100 years to find something like that. And this was a huge policy failure. And this is why, by the way, that you have left governments have been elected in most of the region since 1998. And Mexico, a lot of people think the Mexicans elected a left government in 2006. It was extremely close. So what happened was, in the 2000s, a lot of these left governments pursued different policies. Some worked better than others, but they all worked a lot better than what you had before. And some of, Chile, by the way, isn't a completely neoliberal. They haven't had completely neoliberal policies either, in terms of their trade and their currency and their industrial policy. So they haven't followed the Mexican model either. And so that is what I think is the big thing that's missing from the debate. What is the great policy failure that led to this collapse? What led to the rebound everywhere but Mexico? If you look through that, you'll find, I think, some answers.
Just very specifically on the agriculture question, yes, the Mexico NAFTA situation is directly related to that, which is explicitly the United States informed Mexico that it would not be allowed to be part of NAFTA and would not be in conformance with the investment chapter rules unless it altered Article 27 of the 1917 Mexican Constitution, which did that's the land reform provision that basically broke up the big plantations. And so the United States this set up what's called the Ejido system, which is the sort of communal plots of land that are collectively owned, that cannot be sold, that the bank cannot take away from you, because you cannot actually lose ownership of them. It's a collective ownership basically in the people. And that was the huge land reform of the Mexican Revolution, and NAFTA reversed that. NAFTA resulted in literally people losing their land and livelihoods in the course of 2 or 3 growing seasons, because for the first time the land actually, because of the change to the constitutional Article 27 as a condition for NAFTA, which happened in 1992 before NAFTA was entered into in 1993 by Mexico, actually made it possible for the first time for someone who had been farming that land for generations to basically lose their land and have no place to go.
Yes.
Well, I've got 2 questions. My name is Thomas Sparrow from BBC. The first one is if you think there are any positive elements to NAFTA in these 20 years. And the second, considering NAFTA was a model, if you think there are lessons that can be drawn for another very important free trade negotiation, and that's TTIP, the one with the European Union. I think any lessons can be drawn there as well.
Well, my own view of NAFTA, but you have experts here who can talk about what's happened in Mexico and Canada, and with the statistics about what's happened in the U.S. From my point of view, this was asked by U.S. press just a few days ago on whether or not I considered it a failure. It has been a failure, and it has increased the income. It has decreased living standards for American workers. We've heard about 845,000 jobs lost that are attributable to what happened here. So that it's very serious repercussions in that area. I will just tell you that what I look at as a member of the Congress in terms of looking at TPP, or whether it is the agreement with Europe, is that I think what we have to do as a country, as the U.S., is take a look at what our economic goals are. What is it that we need to achieve economically as a country? And I look at most pieces of legislation through that kind of a filter. And I ask myself, is what we're going to achieve here, does it raise living standards for the people in the United States? Will it restore the middle class? And will it restore American jobs? That certainly wasn't the case with NAFTA. It is not the case on the TPP. On those three measures, this agreement fails. And I don't know what will be forthcoming with the European agreement. But I can focus in on TPP and just say that across the board that will have a devastating effect on wages, living standards, and a loss of American jobs, and thereby really devastating to being able to rebuild the middle class in this nation today. Not by my thoughts or my own views, but we have a staggering problem of stagnant wages in the United States and what's happened here. You know, I was with a group of tech companies, small tech companies in my state of Connecticut just about 2 weeks ago. And one of the first people to get up is a gentleman who trains CEOs of small businesses, manufacturing businesses, smart tech companies. And he said, you can give me all of the tax credits you want. You can give me an $8,000 tax credit. I am not going to create a $40,000 job. But the problem here is that we need demand in order to be able to sell our products here. And we are not creating demand, and that is a problem with what's happening to wages here. So those are the three filters that when I look at these pieces of legislation, of what I want to try to see happen. And as I said, NAFTA hasn't done that, and TPP doesn't do it.
Yeah, I think it's vitally important to have a different set of criteria to look exactly at what happens to people's lives in this. And one of the big lessons that we've seen from Mexico is that not only has NAFTA not worked in these social criteria, but it turns out that it's really not a framework of one country losing and another country winning. That when we look at this Mexico data and we compare it to what Public Citizen has done in terms of the U.S. data and how workers have lost out, what we find that instead is that it's the farmers, the family farmers, the workers, the unions that are losing overall in all three countries, and the transnational corporations and a very small but privileged economic elite that's gaining from these free trade agreements. That's why it's no coincidence that in almost every one you look at, what you see is this increase in polarization in terms of income distribution. We've seen this in meetings between family farmers in the United States who are saying, over this period we've lost our farms, and the small peasant farmers in Mexico that are saying the same. So the similarities down on the level of the average citizen are far greater than any framework that would compare the impacts of NAFTA on a national level.
Yeah, I would say there aren't positive outcomes, but one positive aspect is actually meeting my counterparts in the consumer environmental movements of Canada and Mexico and working with them, and now spending 20 years watching what this model wrought. And now we're backing it together in TPP, trying to make sure we don't expand the problem. So I would say, as far as solidarity in figuring out exactly what Laura just described together, that it's not our country versus your country, but it's the model that does or doesn't benefit certain categories of interest in all the countries, has for me been a positive aspect of enlightenment, but the outcome is not good. On the European agreement, I didn't want to accidentally steal your thunder because Congresswoman DeLauro is the leader on this, but one issue I would say gives you a lesson from NAFTA for TTIP is the food safety issue. And Congresswoman DeLauro has really been the champion in Congress who's made everyone understand and be aware of the fact that these trade agreements impose limits on food standards. Well, typically in the case of NAFTA, for instance, as you've pointed out, it's been a problem for the U.S. because, for instance, before NAFTA, we didn't import any meat or poultry but from one beef processing plant from Mexico. Then we got the standard equivalence rule, which means you have to basically inspect it and pass one place, accept it everywhere. And so suddenly we have a flood of imported poultry and beef coming into the U.S. that doesn't meet our standards. Well, in the context of the EU, you're us. So U.S. meat and poultry standards are significantly less protective of consumer health and safety than those in the European Union. So if you want, for instance, feces-contaminated, chlorine-dunked chickens, currently ban those chlorine-dunked chickens. Plus you have a zero feces contamination standard. Seemingly reasonable. We do not, I might add, bon appetit. Then you will be getting those chlorine-dunked feces-dripped chickens. Alternatively, if you would like a side of ractopamine with your pork, that would be a drug I myself would like to avoid. It's enough to make a person kosher, whether or not you actually are a member of that faith. Yes, you will have ractopamine pork. And it will be approved here, so you'll have to accept it there. There are other disgusting details of that problem, but I would say that is perhaps the most clear NAFTA lesson for the European Union-U.S. agreement.
Can I say just one thing on that? You know, I'm glad I'm a vegetarian, but
They don't want to know about TPP.
but you know, just I don't know why anybody still refers to any of these as free trade agreements. I mean, first of all, they're barely even trade agreements. TPP has, 29 chapters and five are trade. But to the extent that they're you could say they deal with questions of free trade, I mean, the main thing is to promote monopolies and patents and copyrights. That's the exact opposite of free trade. And so these are really the most, from an economic point of view, going forward. I mean, you could say for Mexico, NAFTA was a free trade agreement, and they busted open their agriculture with devastating consequences. But, going forward, the countries we're negotiating, we have pretty much free trade with anyway, and it really is to, from a purely economic point of view, the economically most important provisions in the agreement, the ones that have economic impact, are the ones that tighten these monopolies and increase the monopoly rents to pharmaceutical companies or holders of copyright. And so I just don't think that people should call them the free trade agreements anymore. We should know that after 20 years.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Sabine from the German Press Agency. You referred before to the Three Amigos Summit, Toluca next week. So given that so far none of the three involved governments seems to share your opinion on NAFTA and all of these, that they're not seem to backtrack and not even open a carry and then Mexican Foreign Minister said recently that they're not thinking about opening up NAFTA. So what would be your pragmatic message to them? What should be done at that summit? What should be discussed in order to get something positive out of that meeting? Is there something positive to get from that?
Well, they are renegotiating NAFTA. It's called the TPP. So, in fact, the three countries are sitting down and they're looking, say, at the investment chapter that's caused all of those investor states attacks and promoted chase to the bottom offshoring. And they're saying, let's expand it. The scope of what's covered should be broader. We saw the leaked TPP text. It's the NAFTA text, plus about 30% more expansive stuff. So it has all of the language from NAFTA, plus those new corporate rights would say apply to any natural resource contract between a government and a private foreign company. Would not go to U.S. courts or domestic courts. Instead, it would go to an investor state tribunal. So they are renegotiating NAFTA. They're making it worse by expanding the model versus taking the incoming data about how that model worked out and trying to figure out how to actually replace it. That is the reality. And the lesson, I would say, for them is, it'd be wonderful if they all sat down and eyeballed each other honestly and said, ruh-roh, that NAFTA didn't work out so well. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. But if they actually had a discussion not based on the data of what they learned from the actual outcomes of NAFTA, then what should that mean if they're looking for the public interest of the three countries with respect to their role in the TPP? I mean, it is like watching the movie Groundhog Day to be having to deal with the TPP negotiations, because the same exact baloney is being dished out as if 20 years of fact-based outcomes of road testing, the exact same rules and proposals, did not exist. It's like they woke up and went, 20 years gone, let's try out this thing. It's kind of new. No, it's not new. We know. And so I would say the advice is look at the outcomes and please adjust.
The fact is it is, from the TPP perspective, because that's where it's been focused our attention, because that's immediate in the sense that this is where the administration has come to negotiated a treaty, pretty much finished up. Maybe parts of it not, we don't know, because there hasn't been any transparency at all in this process to take a look at it. But to add to what Laurie has said is, this is about freeing up banks from regulations. This is about environmental standards being weakened. This is about the food safety issues, which my interest has been around the food safety interest for the United States. We know today that we have stopped at the border 206 we have 206 times we have stopped contaminated product from Vietnam coming in. This is in shrimp, which is either decomposed, which is contaminated, which is laced with filth, with pesticides, etc. We do not have today the inspection capability of the amount of imported seafood that will continue to come in. We also know with regard to Malaysia, which is a transshipment point for China, bringing product in, and we know about the level of contamination of product from China coming into the U.S. in terms of food. But our food safety issues are being undermined, and then with regard to pharmaceutical companies in this effort, that life-saving drugs are going to be less accessible in some countries here. So that why are we, if we're going to rethink trade policy, not do what we've been doing all along, which the data that you've heard here today demonstrates that it hasn't worked for the United States, it hasn't worked for Mexico, and Canada has significant difficulties with this as well. But we are going down the same road. And therefore, there has to be that has to stop. And what also has to stop from the U.S. perspective, from the U.S. Congress perspective, is that we are not going to be in the position of just putting an imprimatur on an agreement in which we have not had not one say. We were supposed to, by virtue of 2007, been consulted have a congressional oversight committee, have our committees of jurisdiction be included at the beginning, middle, and end of the process. None of that has happened, which is why 190 of us, Democrats and Republicans, said we will not. This current process for fast track is a non-starter, and we will oppose it. And that is what the view is, and that we will oppose a TPP on the basis that we've talked about already.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we have to turn the room over now, and so we're going to draw the panel to a close. Thank you all for being here. We'll be around for chatting in the hallway, and we look forward to continuing this discussion. Thanks again.